Students, friends, and colleagues, thank you for coming in this public forum today. Our speaker for today is Dr. Zhang Dongbing, or maybe we can also call him Dr. Moose. Thank you for making the time to share your knowledge, Dr. Moose. This forum is sponsored by the International Research Collaboration, World Class University, UI, under the leadership of Harni Kartika, who is with us today. Thank you, Bu Harni, for making this forum for us. And here we already have the head of linguistic department of FIBUI. Thank you for coming, Dr. Sonia. Please allow me to invite Dr. Sonia to give. Dr. Sonia, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Mbak Zahro. Can you guys hear me? Yes, right.
Yes.
Thank you. So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, students, and distinguished speaker. I would like to give you a warm welcome to our webinar this morning with the title Describing and Characterizing Mood as a Closed System, Data, Axis, and Discourse, delivered by our esteemed colleague, Dr. Zhang Dongbing, whom we usually call Mus. Today's topic is very interesting for us in the linguistics study program, as there has been a growing interest among the students to conduct research in the field of systemic functional linguistics. I must admit that my knowledge on this topic is still very little. I myself have read books and some journal articles about conducting a research on mood applied on various types of clause. And I can help but be amazed of the complexities and the possibilities of the result that come out of the research. Of course, having to read books is different from listening to an expert talking about the topic. We usually can understand much more when something is explained to us directly. So that's why that's what we are aiming with today's webinar. With the extensive knowledge of the research, I hope we can get a better glimpse of the topic mood delivered by Dr. Mus. I would like to thank my colleague Harni for making this event possible. I'm sure that this event could bring a lot of benefits to our students in particular, as well to the linguistics department in general. And my sincere gratitude also goes to Zahro, who kindly took the role of the moderator today. And last but not least, thank you to our speaker, Dr. Mus, who is also keen on sharing his experience and expertise in the field. I hope that in the future, our collaboration could be more strengthened and expanded. So without further ado, I would like to wish you all a pleasant and fruitful webinar today. Thank you. So back to you, Mbak Zahro.
Thank you, Dr. Sonia. Let's move on to our next agenda. It is photo session. Please turn on your camera and give your big smile. Mbak Regina, please help us with the screenshot.
Okay. I will take the photo in. Wait. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Maybe another photo. Wait a second. Okay, please smile, everyone. 1, 2, 3. Okay, and for the next slide, we get a lot of participants here. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you, Mbak Regina, and thank you for your smile, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues. Before we move on to our main agenda, I like to remind you to mute your microphone. And if you have any question during the presentation, please write it in the chat box or just keep it in mind and you can ask it directly after the presentation of Dr. Moose. Okay, Dr. Mus is a lecturer at the School of International Studies, University of International Business and Economics. Last year, in 2020, he has finished his PhD in the University of Sydney, Australia. His work focused on language typology based on SFL, and some of his latest publications are Dynamism in Knowledge Exchange, Developing Move System based on Cochin-Mongolian Interaction, Tense in Cochin-Mongolian and Interpersonal Perspective, Interpersonal Grammar in Cochin-Mongolian, the Nominal Group in Cochin-Mongolian, a systemic functional perspective, and his current projects are development and application of Cochin-Mongolian conversation, grammatical metaphor in disciplinary Mongolian. And without further ado, let us listen to the presentation of Dr. Mus. Dr. Mus, screen is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Sakura, for hosting, and thank you, Dr. Sonia, for your opening. And thank you, Hani, for inviting me, giving me this opportunity to talk at your university again. All right, I'm going to share my screen. If you can see the screen with full mode, give me a thumb up. Yeah, cool. Okay, all right. And this is not supposed to be the presenter view. So if you're seeing the presenter view, you can also remind me. So the topic of my talk today is describing and characterizing mood as a clause system, data, access, and discourse. Now I'm emphasizing that describing and characterizing mood as a clause system, because in many traditional grammars done in language description, mood is considered as a system for verb system. But in systemic functional linguistics, we're focusing on its the way it works at the level of clause. Now today, I'm going to talk about four things. First of all, I'll talk about what is mood and where mood is in terms of our description of language. And then in the second part, I'm going to talk about what kind of data you can use to start your own description if you want to describe the language you speak. And the third one is the method of argumentation you can use, or typically used in systemic functional linguistics. And the last part is how you can characterize your description based on discourse patterns. So from the agenda, you can see that in the way I organize my talk today is the aim is more to share with you the way you can start your own description instead of just talking about my own research. Hope that suits the aim of our forum. All right, so the first question, what is mood? Now, in key terms in systemic functional linguistics, mood is defined as the primary interpersonal system of the clause. It is the grammaticalization of the semantic system of speech function in the clause in adopting and assigning speech roles, such as questioner and answerer. So when we talk, we assign each other different roles, right? We've got questioner and answerer, for example. And the selection of system of mood type typically include two primary grammatical categories. One is indicative, the other is imperative. And within indicative, we normally talk about declarative, interrogative, and so on. And they correlate with different aspects of exchange. We might be exchanging information or exchanging goods and services. Here's an example from English. So for an example of an English declarative clause would be, she's a cat person. And its correlating interrogative would be, is she a cat person? Or you can have an imperative, adopt a cat. Okay. Then where is mood? As I just said, a lot of traditional description consider mood as a verb system. But what about in systemic functional linguistics? What is the semiotic address, we call it? In order to answer this question, we need to introduce the idea of function rank matrix. Okay, this is quite a big table. Let's take a look at some details of it. First of all, if you take a look at the left side of this table, we've got something called stratum. So stratum is the level of phenomenon we're looking at. So we might be looking at the level of sound, then we're looking at phonology, yeah? Or we're looking at the level of wording, the way we organize our choice of words, or the particular selection of words, then we're looking at lexical grammar. And the second column is called rank. So rank is SFL way of talking about constituency. So what is something made of? So here we can talk about a clause being made of group and phrases, and group and phrases being made of word, and words made of morpheme. And these can be realized through tone group in phonology. And the last dimension we need to think about is called metafunction. So I'm sure if you read some systemic functional work, then you must be very familiar with this concept already. So we talk about the different kinds of meaning we make with language. For example, we've got logical meaning, experiential meaning, interpersonal, and textual. And we normally group logical and experiential together as ideational meaning. So we use language to construe a world, we use language to construct interpersonal relations, and then we use language to compose all these into text. Okay, then where is mood? Mood is here. So if we take a look at this big picture, this big map, then we can orient ourselves in terms of metafunction. So mood is an interpersonal system, first of all, so it's related to our organization of social relationships. And in terms of rank, we're looking at a clause system. Let me see if I can get a, oh, no. Just to see if I can use the pen here. Just give me a second. Okay, so we're looking at clause as far as rank is concerned, and then we're looking at lexical grammar. Okay, so we've got three dimensions we can use to characterize the thing we're looking at. So this is our address. So we've got so many systems in a language, we're focusing on this small part called mood. Or if you look at a similar table here, we have more detail. So we're looking at clause system of mood. Mood is a subsystem for interacting dialogically. You know, when we talk to each other, we need to use this system. Okay, so that's the first part. We've got some idea of what mood is and where mood is located as far as semiosis is concerned. Then the second question is, if you want to describe the mood system of your own language, then where can you start? In order to answer that question, we need to look at a number of other studies people have done previously. But the general tip is to don't start with introspective data. So you might read about mood in very canonical descriptions in systemic functional linguistics, or there are books dedicated to interpersonal grammar. And you might be inclined to use the categories there and think about whether you, in your language, you have that particular category. And so don't do that. So that's not a really good way to start the description. So don't start with introspective data. Then where can we start? Well, this is a work by Halliday, the canonical work, An Introduction to Functional Grammar. So when he was talking about mood, he used traditional rhyme. That's one thing you can use. So we have lots of these kind of things in our cultures, right? So he loves me, he don't, he'll help me, he won't. He would if he could, but he can't, so he don't. Or you can take a look at a typical way people negotiate information. So here, again, in Halliday's book, he used this example quite often. The Duke's given away the teapot, hasn't he? Oh, has he? Yes, he has. No, he hasn't. I wish he had. He hasn't, but he will. Will he? He might. So quite dialogic. Or in Matheson's book called Lexicogrammatical Cartography, which gives an overview of the English language system. Aside from using exchange like these ones, so what's your name now? Joe So. You haven't met Stanley, have you, Mr. Goldberg? I haven't had the pleasure. Or you can also refer to corpus. So here, I'm not sure that they would be interested in it, but they might. They might. So this is from a corpus. So you can go to corpus and look for conversational data. And if you look at the later versions of Introduction to Functional Grammar, you will see more and more data from corpus and probably the authors collected in their daily life or from other sources. For example, here, when they were talking about mood, you can see that this is the first text in that particular chapter. They used a Carol conversation here. So, Mummy Poof keeps scaring me, keep getting into my bed, and kind of like he's going to bite me. He won't bite you, darling. Well, I'm still afraid of him because he's bitten me. Just push him off. I'm trying really hard, but he doesn't go off, and so on and so on. So there's some natural dialogue going on between mother and daughter. And in the same book, later on, you'll see that, they also used corpus again, so COCA, contemporary, I think, corpus of American English. And they also use data from interviews, which is also quite dialogic, right? You can talk to, so more about dialogues than monologues, and not introspective, but you collect data from different sources. Or in Martin 1992 English text, he used examples from Monty Python to exemplify a certain aspect of English mood. Some of you might have watched this already, but I'll just play a bit of it so that you get an idea of the kind of data he was looking at.
Is this the right one for an argument? I've told you once. No, you haven't.
Now, I'm guessing you can't hear it, can you? Can you hear it?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Oh, you can, okay.
Is this the right one for an argument?
I've told you once.
No, you haven't.
Yes, I have.
When?
Just now.
No, you didn't.
Yes, I did.
Didn't.
I did.
Didn't.
I'm telling you I did.
You did not.
Oh, I'm sorry, is this a 5-minute argument or the full half hour?
Oh, just the 5-minute one.
Fine. Thank you. Anyway, I did.
You most certainly did not.
Now, let's get one thing quite clear. I most definitely told you.
You did not.
Yes, I did.
You did not.
Yes, I did.
Didn't.
Yes, I did.
Didn't.
Yes, I did.
No, this isn't an argument.
Yes, it is.
No, it isn't. It's just contradiction.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
It is not.
It is.
Okay, so you see the kind of data you can use in your own description, right? Quite simple and back and forth, and there's some contradiction that would really help. There are also other sources of data you can draw on. For example, in a work on Chilean Spanish, Quiroz used data from an MA thesis. So there are lots of, I'm sure people have collected a lot of conversational data in other studies, but not intended for language description. So you can also go to those studies and look for comparable data. For example, here she was looking at cable TV service. So I don't read Spanish, I don't speak Spanish, so I can't really share how this sounds, but you get the idea. So people come to the house and fix the TV and they talk to one another. All right, so the kind of data people are using, first of all, they are quite conversational because mood is, the resource in mood is quite prominent in dialogue. So it's easy to start there. and it's interactive. So if you, for example, if you use lecture as an example, it's probably not a really good data because it's one way, right? It's better do two ways, so people talk back and forth. And if it's difficult for you to collect conversational and interactive data from daily lives or from other sources, then you can also use existing corpus. Or you can draw on other studies. So some people might have collected dialogues, but not intended for description. You can still use those, and you can also go to films and books, particularly if the language you're describing is quite vibrant. All right, then what about languages that are not really vibrant, are not really well recorded, or they're not in the published mode? Then you might need to do some field work, which is what I did for my PhD. So for my PhD, I described a dialect of Mongolian called Hartun Mongolian, which is also my mother tongue. So in case you are wondering, Inner Mongolia is within the border of China. Here. And you guys are here, so quite far away. And it's different from Mongolia. Okay, Mongolia is another country outside China. So we're looking at a minority language spoken in China. And the place where I collected my data is called Hingal Lake. So in the eastern part of Inner Mongolia. And then within that area, I also zoomed in on somewhere called Jalat Bena, smaller and smaller. And the picture on the right side is what the scene is like in the morning in winter. Okay, so what kind of data did I collect for my PhD? I collected data from family in an office, and also I followed government members. I'm going to talk about them one by one. I think there are some other voices. Okay, all right. The first set of data is from a family. So I stayed with, actually, this is my aunt and uncle. So I stayed at their home for a week and recorded their daily conversations after work, which was quite useful. So this is a naturally happening conversation, right? So it's a good way to start your research. And the other thing I did was to stay with my former teacher at a primary school in the Mongolian sector. So they were teaching Mongolian at this primary school, and I sat in their office for a week and recorded their conversations after school. So they talked about a lot of things, including things from the classroom and also things about their family and their friends. So quite a large array of data. I'm gonna play a, so this is their office on the left. I stayed at one of the corners there. Okay, that's what it sounds like. So that I was recording what they were talking about in the office. And the third part of my data set was I followed two government officials who are on the left side of the slide to the villagers' homes. And so they were talking about some subsidies from the government, and I recorded their conversation. So this is another way that you can collect data through fieldwork. This can be quite handy if the language is spoken around you. So you might collect data from your friends, your family, and you can also follow people around to record their conversations. One of the difficulties with this kind of data collection is that you need to apply for ethics and you need to get approval from the participants. So it's going to be it requires a bit paperwork compared to the other sources of data. Okay, so that's the second part. Now that you have your data, you can start to describe your data. And in the third part, I'm going to talk about the method of argumentation you can use to describe your data. Okay, so in systemic functional linguistics, or particularly in the Halliday's development, and then in the Halliday model of the systemic functional linguistics, because we've got different models. The primary means of argumentation we use is called axial argumentations. What does axial argumentation mean? So axial argumentation involves two axes, paradigmatic and syntagmatic. And in traditional, for example, in Saussure's work, if you are familiar, we're looking at associative and syntagmatic relations, yeah? We're looking at, in other words, choice, so different choices you have, and chain, so how you arrange your structure, or we're looking at system and structure. That's what we call in systemic functional linguistics, system and structure. Okay, let's take a look at some images, some figures, so that we'll have some idea of how we can organize our description. So in systemic functional linguistics, when you describe a system of a language, you typically draw something called system network. And this is a system. So a system typically, a system has features. So we've got two features here. That means you've got two choices. And then you have an entry condition. So for example, entry condition here means the unit you're looking at. For example, you're looking at clause, then a clause can have option 1 and option 2. Yeah, okay. So this is paradigmatic choice relation, either or. And these systems can be all arranged in terms of delicacy. So for example, if you're A, then you have the choice between B and C. And if you're C, then you have a choice between D, E, and F. And if you select E, then you have a choice between G and H. So different choices. You can order your system in this way. Now, I'm talking about this in a very abstract way at the moment, but we're going to look at more detailed descriptions later on. So here's an example of a description of mood in English. So in English, if it's a clause, then you need to make a distinction between indicative and imperative. And if it's indicative, then you need to make a distinction between declarative and interrogative. And you've got some examples down here. And we've already looked at these examples. Okay. But it's not enough to only have paradigmatic relations. That you can't only talk about choice, but you also need to talk about chain, so structure, the way it is organized. So for each feature in a system, you need to have structural statements, so that they are realized by a particular kind of structure. So again, this is the mood system of English. So for English, if we've got the distinction between imperative and indicative for mood or a clause, then for indicative, you need to have subject and finite. And if it's a indicative, then you need to have declarative and interrogative. And for interrogative, we have subject coming before finite. Again, this is quite abstract, and we're going to look at how we can do this in our own description later on with examples. Okay, anyway, here's an example. So for example, in English, an imperative clause, you would have a predicator, so give her the teapot. But if it's a declarative, then you need to have subject and finite. He's giving her the teapot, yeah? And for interrogative, you need to place the finite before the subject, yeah? So we've got, is he giving her teapot? He's giving her teapot. So we reverse the order, subject and finite. So you've got ordering of elements. So which one comes first, yeah? And second and third and so on. And also inclusion of particular elements. So this is what we call structure. Again, so summarizing how we can do this. So we need to have paradigmatic relation and then syntagmatic relation. And we call the paradigmatic side system, which is realized by structure. And structure is again realized by syntax. All right. So this is the general principle you can use in a description. Sometimes the structure may be realized by a particular particle. So for example, here we have an example from Mandarin Chinese. So 都没有意见吧. So here ba, which is the function of which is called negotiator, is realized by a particle. And you can draw that in your own system. So for addressee-oriented interrogative clause, we have querying and confirming, which require a particulate realization of the negotiator. Okay, so we have system and structure. When I'm talking about this, I begin to realize this is very dense. So you might be a bit lost at the moment, but don't worry. So as long as you remember, we need to have system and structure is realizing system. Is enough. Then if we have data, we have our data, right? Then how do we derive from our data to the system we're going to draw? So there are two kind of relations you need to think about. One is called enation and the other is called agnation. Let's take a look at what they are. According to Gleason, enation refers to two sentences or two structures that are said to be innate if they have identical structures. That is, if the elements at equivalent places in the sentence are of the same classes and if the construction in which they occur at the same time, Let's take a look at these two examples and you'll see what I mean. So the dog bit the man, or the cat ate the canary. So we can see that the relationship between the and dog is the same with the relationship between the and cat. And bit is related to the man, ate is related to the canary, sorry. So, and the class here is the same. So we've got determiner, noun, verb, determiner, noun. And we say that these two sentences are innate. Okay, so for these two sentences, we've got the same class, right? So that man, they're all nominal groups. Lives, all verbal groups. In the white house, in the grayish house, in the brick red house, they're all prepositional phrase. And if we see this kind of pattern, then we say that these are innate. And complementarily, we've got another kind of relation, which is called agnation. It refers to pairs of sentences with the same major vocabulary items, but with different structures. Sorry. Pairs of sentences with the same major vocabulary items, but with different structures. And difference in structure might appear in difference in arrangement. So some of the element might come before and after the other element. Or accompanying function words, like in the case of Mandarin Chinese, we've got the bar particle or some other structure markers. Okay, so for example, the dog bit the man versus did the dog bite the man, or did the dog bite the man versus the dog bit the man. Yeah, you can reverse these two set of sentences. Then we can say that the dog bit the man and did the dog bite the man are agnate. So they're agnate to one another. We're looking at agnation. So when we describe mood or any system in systemic functional linguistics, we need to think about these two kinds of relationships. So we need to think about horizontally here, we've got the dog bit the man and did the dog bite the man. We have an agnate relation of agnation. And at the same time, the dog bit the man is innate to the cat ate the canary. Yeah, sorry, the canary. So did the cat eat the canary? The cat eat the canary. Yeah. We can also represent this in this way. So the dog bit the man is agnate to did the dog bite the man, and the cat ate the canary is agnate to did the cat eat the canary. Now, if you look at the mood system of English, so for declarative clause here we have, let me use the pen again. So for declarative clause, we've got the dog bit the man, or the cat ate the canary here, which is agnate to these two. Yeah. So did the dog bite the man, or did the cat eat the canary? And here we see that the difference between them is the order of finite and subject. Oops. And subject. So for declarative clause, subject comes before the finite, and for interrogative, the finite comes before the subject. How do we know? Because yeah, one way that we can know which part is subject and finite is to try to change the mood, yeah, from declarative to interrogative. Then we've got the position between subject and finite, and we see that the subject is realized by a nominal group, and the finite is realized by a verbal group, and it's the same down here. So the finite is realized by a verbal group, and the subject is realized by a nominal group. Okay. Now I'm going to introduce a bit about the mood in Hartun Mongolian. So I had my data, then how did I describe it? So again, what you're doing is looking at patterns. Now, one of the first patterns I observed is that for some clauses, there has to be a verbal component, but for others, you don't need verbal components. So for example, in Hartun Mongolian, if it's an indicative clause, then you may or may not have a verbal component, but for imperative clause, you have to have a verbal component. So here is an example. This is an interaction between father and daughter in the kitchen. Okay. And the father is asking the daughter what a piece of cloth is. Okay, so here the father asked, is that a cleaning towel or a hand towel? And the daughter replied, it can be whatever you want it to. So here you see that the first clause does not have a verbal component. It doesn't have a verbal group in it, but the second one does. The second instance is interaction is between mother and daughter. So they were making a cake, and the daughter is asking the mother if they need to start the blender. The mother is asking the daughter whether she should start the blender. So, do I blend or should I blend? Yes, blend. All right, and then the mother starts the blender. So here we've got we have an imperative clause here. And I'll talk about why we know this is an imperative clause. So here for imperative clause, you have to have a verbal component. But for indicative clause, you may or may not have a verbal component. Then how do we know if a clause is indicative or imperative if they both have verbal components? We know this because indicative and imperative, the verbal components are different. So for indicative clause, the verbal components or verbal group are marked for tense, aspect, polarity, and modality. But for imperative ones, the verbal group is marked for person. So first, second, and third. Okay, now if we look at this indicative clause, So So here, Bolin, we've got a non-past tense marker. Yeah, and we know that this is okay. This is about time. Yeah, we've got the time tense marker. And again, here in an indicative clause, we have a non-past. Yeah, tense marker. Do I blend? All right. So for indicative clause, the verbal group is marked for tense. But for imperative ones, it is marked for person. So here is marked for second person. So you do the blending. All right, now then we can draw our system network. So for a clause in Arctic Mongolian, we have a distinction between indicative and imperative. And for indicative, you might have a verbal group or not. So if you have a verbal group, then your verbal group, we call that functional predicator. Yeah, and they're realized by different types of verbal group. For the indicative one, we call it elaborated verbal group because it involves a number of markers like tense, polarity, modality, and so on. And we call the one for imperative a restricted one because it doesn't select from all these systems. It can only select from person and aspect. Okay. And within indicative, we've got different options as well. So for indicative, we have declarative and interrogative, but they require different kind of realizations. For declarative clauses, we have a positional function, which is realized by a modal particle. And for interrogative, we have interrogator function, which is realized by interrogative particles. So we've got different particles at the end of the clause. So for example, here we have a declarative clause, So here 시더 is a modal particle realizing the positional function. And this particle means you should have known. Yeah. It can be whatever you want. Or if we have an interrogative clause, then 불검에. So here we have an interrogative particle. So here IP means interrogative particle. And the function of that interrogative particle is called interrogator. But it's not necessarily the case for declarative clauses to have a modal particle. So a declarative clause might have a modal particle like the one we looked at, So we've got 시더. Or you don't have that. So so you don't need to have the 시더. So you can have only predicator only, or predicator plus a positional. For interrogative clauses, we've got two kinds. So the first one is called polar interrogative. So it's either yes or no, also known as yes/no interrogative or yes/no question in traditional description. So an ulubretarme, is this sentence correct? So here me is an interrogative particle, yeah, and it's realizing a function called interrogator, and it's following the predicator. Or we can ask about a particular element in the clause, and we call that elemental interrogative. So an 유걸 희생다. So 유걸 is asking about the way in which you, or the source of the material you use to make the thing you're talking about. So here we call this function an inquirer. Yeah, inquirer function. Okay, so inquirer comes before predicator and interrogator. So this is the case when we're asking about, we call a circumstance, yeah. You can also inquire or ask questions about the participant and process. So here, for example, you can ask about the participant, who came. So here the inquirer is conflated with a participant. So this slash here is called conflation. So it's playing two roles at the same time. Yes. Or you can ask about the process itself. So for example, in this particular clause, in this particular interaction, the nephew and aunt are talking about a dumpling they made. So the aunt is saying that we need to make more dumpling. And the nephew is saying, no, the ones we have is enough. The aunt said, then you have to finish all the dumplings. And the nephew said, yes, I will finish all the dumplings. And the nephew is teasing the aunt by saying, so what happens if I don't finish them all? So here, what happens? This process is asked. So what would happen, right? So the process itself is being asked. It's not the participant or the means. Okay, so we have a general sketch of the mood system in Hartz Mongolian. So for indicative clauses, you need to have an elaborated verbal group to realize the predicator. And the options are either declarative or interrogative. If it's an interrogative, then you have interrogator function, which is realized by an interrogative particle. And this interrogative is, in turn, can be divided into polar, which is asking about yes and no, or elemental, which is asking about the particular element of the clause, for example, a participant, process, or circumstance. Okay, and so on. I won't bore you with more details here. Okay. Now I'm just looking at time, and I think I can skip this. So for imperative clause, we're looking at the realization of the verbal group in terms of first, second, and third person. All right, I'll skip this part. Okay. Now what you end up with when you do descriptions like this one is a system like on the one on the left. So you've got quite elaborated relationship between different systems. And the one I just showed you is this part, yeah? So you can have declarative or interrogative, and interrogative you have polar or elemental. So you can talk about this, reason about this based on your own data. Now there's much more to interpersonal grammar than the one I just showed you. So here for interpersonal grammar, we have mood, which is what we're talking about. But you also need to consider all the other interpersonal systems as well. When you're describing mood, you will come across all these kind of systems. Okay, so you can use axial argumentation in your description. So you need to think about enation and agnation, looking at patterns in your data. And then you need to represent the kind of relationship you observe in the data in terms of system network. So features, options, they are realized by structure. The next step you can take is to characterize your description in terms of discourse. So what we've been looking at so far is grammar. You know, we've got formal, structural differences. We're looking at structural differences, but how does that relate to discourse, the kind of interaction we're looking at? There are at present two kinds of systems available in systemic functional linguistics you can draw on. As far as the characterization of mood is concerned, the first one is called speech functions, which is developed by Halliday. And the other one is called exchange structure, developed by Margaret Berry and later by J.R. Martin. So they've got different concerns. The starting point of Halliday's speech functions are dialogue. So he was trying to understand dialogue as a semiotic process. But Berry was trying to develop Sinclair and Coulthard's study on classroom discourse, so initiation, response, and feedback. Let's take a look at how they are the same and different from one another, and what you can do with your data if you want to characterize the discourse meaning of your the mood system you're looking at. Let's take a look at speech function first. So for speech function, if you read Halliday's book, you are probably familiar with this already. So here, for a speech you can understand this in terms of speech act. So you might be initiating or responding, and at the same time, you need to think about whether you are giving or demanding. If you're giving or demanding information, if you're giving information, for example, then you are making a statement. If you are demanding information, then you are asking a question. And if you're giving goods and services, then you're providing an offer. And if you're demanding an action, goods or services, then you are making a command. Let's take a look at some example. So give me a herald, please. Here, we have a command and a compliant response. Let me fix it for you. Yes, do. So here we have an offer and an acceptance of that offer. Or you can ask questions and answer that question. So is it cold outside? It is. Or you can make statement and then acknowledge that I met Colin today. Did you? Now, this has been quite useful for describing the clause system of English. So what their function is in discourse, right? So for example, if you look at these examples again, this first command, get me a herald, please, is realized in grammar by an imperative clause. Let me fix it for you. So again, we've got imperative and imperative. Is it cold outside? It is. So we have a question realized by an interrogative clause and an answer realized by a declarative clause. I met Colin today, did you? So we have a declarative clause and interrogative clause. So we can describe the role of these clauses in discourse by drawing on speech function. But there are advantages and disadvantages to the speech function model. The pros is that it interprets the English mood system quite well, because the English language, the mood system is mainly based on the mood element, right? So for declarative, we've got subject finite. For interrogative, we have finite subject and so on. So it's useful for interpretation of English mood system. But it cons, the downside is that it can only be used to talk about pairs of interact. So we've got two things, right? Initiating and then responding, a pair. That's it. So different from this one, there's another tool you can use to describe or characterize your mood system based on exchange in discourse. All right. So for Barry, she was trying to develop the classroom discourse analyzed by Sinclair and Coulthard, and she was looking at the rank of exchange. Let me give you some examples and then talk about this. So for example, here's an example of a quiz master and contestant. So in England, which cathedral has the tallest spire? Salisbury, yes. Which English cathedral has the tallest spire? Salisbury. Oh, okay. So if we analyze this in terms of Sinclair and Coulthard's classroom discourse, then we have initiation, response, and feedback. Yeah, initiation, response, and feedback. But here we see that the last one, the feedback, is actually different in the first interaction and the second one. So for the first one, the feedback is obligatory, especially if you're in a classroom, for example. If you're a teacher and you ask your students a question, then when that student gives you an answer, you have to say it's correct or not, right? So we've got an obligatory one. But for the second one, this last move is optional, okay? Instead, the second one is obligatory. So when someone asks you a question, you have to answer. And Barry tries to interpret this similarity and difference between these two interactions in terms of transmission of information. So if we want to successfully, so her understanding of dialogue is that when we talk, we're actually transmitting information. So I might know information, I'm giving you that information, or I might not know the information and demanding the information from you. And the process is called transmission of information. And in order to understand transmission of information, dialogue in terms of transmission of information, she thought about speech roles in terms of primary and secondary knower. So who knows the information and has authority over the information and who does not. Okay, so in the first instance, the quizmaster knows the information, right? So when the quizmaster asks the contestant, in England, which cathedral has the tallest spire, he or she already knows the answer, and they would need to testify whether the information given by the contestant is correct or not. But in the second instance, when the son asks the father a question, the son does not know the answer. It's the father instead who knows the answer. So the role of father in the second exchange is similar to the role of the quizmaster in the first exchange. And Berry called that speech role primary knower. And the complementary role, someone who does not know the information or does not have authority over the information, is called secondary knower. Now, if you learned some classroom discourse analysis, you're probably already using this in your research. But this can also be used to characterize your mood options from the perspective of discourse. How can we do that? Because primary knower role and secondary knower role are related to the structure of your exchange. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to use 1 to represent primary knower and 2 to represent secondary knower. So for the first exchange, quizmaster is the primary knower, and in the second exchange, the father is the primary knower. And in the first one, the contestant, the secondary knower, and in the second one, the son is the secondary knower. Okay. And Berry called the obligatory move K1. So for the first one, it's the third move in which the quizmaster shows that they know the information, right? So we call that K1. And in the second one is the second move in which the father knows that he knows the information. So here we have 2 K1s. And in the second one, the K1 is initiated by a K2, which is the secondary knower role. And this is the same in the first one. But the difference between the two is that in the first one, the primary knower first asks whether the other person knows the information or not, right? Okay, so we have a DK1, and D here refers to delay, primary knower indication. And in the second instance, this K1 is followed by the secondary knower, and we call that K2F. So here F refers to follow up move. So we have different structure for these two exchange. For the first one, we've got DK1, K2, K1. And in the second one, we have K2, K1, K2F. Okay, different speech roles and different slots in the exchange. So these exchange might look the same at first, but they are actually quite different. So the primary knower and secondary knower are interlocutor roles adopted and cast in an exchange, right? So we have different social roles when we talk to one another, and this is the role of primary knower and secondary knower. And these roles are positioned through different structure or different functions in an exchange. So DK1, K2, K1, and K2, K1, K2F. So these, we know these because of the we know these functions because of the obligatory and optional moves in an exchange, and they position interlocutors into different roles. Okay, so primary and secondary knower are knower roles or interlocutor roles based on the structural description we have of exchange. Okay. Now, I'm going to skip the next part because I prepared too much slides for 1 hour. So these are just examples of the data I just showed you, okay? All right, so why is this effective? I mean, why do we need exchange structure analysis? Because exchange structure analysis can be used to talk about exchange comprising up to five moves, okay? Let me see if I can find one instance that has 5 moves in it. No, I don't have it on my slide. Anyway, so it's different from, oops. It's different from holidays in the sense that, you know, here now we have, we can handle up to 5 moves, but for holiday speech function, we can only deal with 2 moves, you know. And the downside is that we don't have sufficient discussion of the realization. So you can talk about the realization of different moves in relation to your own language. Okay. All right. The exchange structure model is also widely applied in applied linguistics work, and Harney has used this model quite a lot in her own work as well. So another point of departure can be classroom discourse, right? You can start to analyze the exchange structure and then see how they are realized in grammar. Okay, so 2 models that you can use. So how did I use it in my own work? I'm not going to go through the examples because of time. I'll just show you the result. For example, in my own work, when I described the mood system of Pashto Mongolian, I also talked about what role they play in different parts of an exchange. So for example, a declarative clause might realize the role of a K1, which is the primary knower role. And you can also talk about, is it the initiating or non-initiating K2? So is the K2 starting the exchange or not? And I did the same for action exchange and imperative mood as well. So for imperative mood, we've got, for example, speaker inclusive, exclusive, and so on, and they can realize different negotiation function, exchange function. Okay. All right, so you can characterize your description in terms of these discourse tools we have available in systemic functional linguistics. Now I'm just going to go over time for a bit to talk about what happens when your data tells you that the existing model is not enough. This happens, yeah? So let me show you a brief interaction or dialogue between 2 teachers. So they're talking about the mode of transport one of the mother was using to take her children to school in winter. So one of the teacher asked, said, so you know that her daughter was commuting to school by motorized truck before. Where Sichin need a motor? No, Sichin always takes her children by motorbike. No, I know she was also commuting by motorized trike. Oh. So here we have a dispute over the mode of transport. Yeah, and if we use and the part that causes problem to analysis is these modal particles. For example, share here means you know, and show here means I know, and you don't know. Okay. Now we can analyze this in terms of exchange structure. So the first one move is a K1. I'm giving you some kind of information and having authority, telling you that I have authority, right? And this is challenged back and forth. And if we have to analyze this in terms of exchange structure, then this third move can also be analyzed as a K1. All right, so we have then 2 potential K1s, but they're apparently different in terms of their role in discourse. We can also use the speech function model to try to characterize this. So the first move is giving information. So I'm telling you something, yeah? And the second one is the same. I'm also giving you an information, a contradictory one. And the third move is also the same. So I'm also giving you an information, a contradictory one. Okay. So apparently the existing model cannot really solve the problem because we have something very complicated going on here. So in this case, if in your description you also have this problem, then what you can do is to develop the existing model. That's what I did for a number of my studies, to focus on ways to develop the exchange structure model so that I can account for my data. So your data might tell you that you need to do something more than what the existing description offers. And this is the system I developed in my research to talk about the different roles of these model particles, okay, in terms of whether it indicates the speaker knows or not, and whether the speaker is assuming the addressee knows or not. Okay, I think I've gone over time already, so that's it. Thank you very much. Terima kasih. And this is what it looks like in Beijing at the moment. We had been snowing for quite a lot in the past 2 days. Thank you.